So today I'm following along on my process of reading some of Dr. Jung's religious letters for the channel, and this is a behind the scenes video, so I make no warranty as to what you're going to see here. Let's see here. I'm doing my best to keep you in the loop because it's been difficult in the last few days. I had a terrible Sunday in terms of my YouTube work because my computer completely blew up on me, and so it took me all day working with Apple and with trying to basically restore my computer 3 different times in the last 24 hours. I finally restored it back far enough so that it would work. And so again, this is behind the scenes encounter. I'm going to take a minute here to set up Periscope so Periscope can have behind the scenes also. And then I'll begin my reading. Just for, sorry, I'll be back to this momentarily. And while I'm on here with you, I will answer questions in chat. After I start reading, I'll stop every 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions. But right now, if anything comes up, I will respond to it immediately. Didn't work too well. Sometimes this Periscope is a little bit finicky, but I'm going to try to resolve my problem now. And there we go. Okay, for Periscope folks, this is behind the scenes at the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group YouTube channel, and I'm going to do a reading of one of Dr. Jung's letters here, and I welcome the person who's having their first day on Periscope today. I hope you stick with it. And if you want to ask questions on chat, it would probably be better if you do so on the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group YouTube channel. And let's see. Okay, So Dr. Jung kicked up quite a controversy in, let's see, when was it? In 1959, so very near the time of his death. He was 83 years old, and he was interviewed by the BBC. And first of all, I want to read the footnote that's attached to this letter. And today I'm reading from The New God Image by Dr. Edward Edinger. And I'll show it to the Periscope people too. And so before, this is a letter. This is a letter to Valentine Brooke. And Mr. Brooke had written a letter to Dr. Jung. And so here is the background. Nothing much is known about Valentine Brooke, I think. It's addressed to Worthing, Sussex. And so the first footnote describes the circumstances. On 22 October 1959, the British Broadcasting Corporation broadcast a television interview with Jung conducted by John Freeman in the series Face to Face. In the course of the interview, Freeman asked, "Do you believe in God?" To which Jung answered after a long pause, "I don't need to believe, I know." These words gave rise to considerable argument, and Brooke sent Jung a rather derogatory review of the broadcast by Maurice Richardson in the London Observer, dated 25 October 1959, as well as some of the correspondence published in the same paper about Jung's words. Brooke asked for their exact meaning. The interview with Freeman is published in C.G. Jung Speaking. Now, some of you who are watching this video may not have had an opportunity to see this video, and it's readily available on YouTube, but I have it set up so that I can add it to this video, and so I'm going to give it to you. It's only a few seconds, but just to give you the flavor of it. And so here are the 20 seconds or so that involve Dr. Jung.
And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now? Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
Okay. Okay, so that was the quote by Dr. Jung. I'm sorry for the Periscope folks didn't get to hear that, but you can find it readily on YouTube. And so in response to Mr. Brooke, who had kindly sent Dr. Jung this negative review, here's the letter. To Valentine Brooke, dated November 16th, 1959. Dear Sir, as you have learned from Mr. Richardson's account, I am an irritating person. This isn't the only irritating. There's some other irritating letters here, but I'm going to save them for later. I am dealing with doubts and views which puzzle the modern mind consciously as well as unconsciously. I am treading on corns right and left. As a consequence, I have to spend a great amount of my time in handing out apologies and explanations for saying things which allude to facts and ideas unknown to the reader. Moreover, the reader is handicapped by his positivistic premise that the truth is simple and can be expressed by one short sentence. Yet nothing is quite true, and even this is not quite true, as Multatuli says. A psychologist concerned with the treatment of mental disturbances is constantly reminded of the fallacies in our verbal formulations. In spite of all the difficulties besetting my way, I will try to explain my standpoint. Whatever I perceive from without or within is a representation or image. A psychic entity caused, as I rightly or wrongly assume, by a corresponding real object. By a corresponding, quote, real, unquote, object. But I have to admit that my subjective image is only grosso modo identical with the object. I guess grosso modo would mean something like in general. So he's saying, but I have to admit that my subjective image is only in general identical with the object. Any portrait painter will agree with this statement, and the physicist will add that what we call colors is really wavelengths. The difference between image and real object shows that the psyche, apperceiving and object, alters by adding and excluding certain details. The image, therefore, is not entirely caused by the object. It is also influenced by certain pre-existent psychic conditions, which we can correct only partially. We cannot remove color perception, for instance. Moreover, we know from experience that all acts of apperception are influenced by pre-existent patterns of perceiving objects, for instance, the premise of causality, particularly obvious in pathological cases, being exaggerations or distortions of so-called normal behavior. They are presuppositions pertaining to the whole of humanity. The history of the human mind offers no end of examples. For instance, folklore, fairy tales, religious symbolism, etc. To explain the spontaneous origin of such parallelisms, the theory of migration is insufficient. I call them archetypes, i.e., instinctual forms of mental functioning. They are not inherited ideas, but mentally expressed instincts, forms, and not contents. They influence our image formation. As experience shows, archetypes are equipped with a specific energy without which they could not have causal effects. Thus, when we try to form an image of the fact one calls God, we depend largely upon innate, pre-existent ways of perceiving, all the more so as it is a perception from within, unaided by the observation of physical facts, which might lend their visible forms to our God image, though there are plenty of cases of the sort. God, therefore, is in the first place a mental image, equipped with instinctual numinosity, i.e., an emotional value bestowing the characteristic autonomy of the effect on the image. This is my chief statement. Now, people unaccustomed to proper thinking assume that it is a final statement. No scientific statement is final. It is a likely formulation of observation and analysis. It goes as far as scientific statement can go, but it does not and cannot say what God is. It only can define what He is in our mind. The mind is neither the world in itself, nor does it reproduce its accurate image. The fact that we have an image of the world does not mean that there is only an image and no world. But this is exactly the argument of those who assume that when I speak of the God image, I mean that God does not exist, as He is only an image. Our images, as a rule, of something, and even delusions are images of something, is modern psychology as amply shown. If, for instance, I imagine an animal which does not exist in reality as we know it, I form the picture of a mythological entity, following the age-old activity of our ancestors in imagining fairy beasts and doctor animals. I am functioning within the frame of an archetype. I am in this case strongly influenced by it. The archetype has efficacy. But although we can be fairly certain that no such animal exists in physical reality, there is nevertheless a real cause which has suggested the creation of the dragon. The dragon image is its expression. The God image is the expression of an underlying experience of something which I cannot attain to by intellectual means, that is, by scientific cognition, unless I commit an unwarrantable transgression. When I say that I don't need to believe in God because I know, I mean I know of the existence of God images in general and in particular. I know it is a matter of universal experience, and, insofar as I am no exception, I know that I have such experience, which I call God. If the experience of my will over against another, it is the experience of my will over and against, and very often stronger will, crossing my path often with seemingly disastrous results, putting strange ideas into my head and maneuvering my fate sometimes into most undesirable corners, or giving it unexpected favorable twists outside my knowledge and my intention. The strange force against or for my conscious tendencies is well known to me. So I say, I know him. But why should you call this something God? I would ask, why not? It has always been called God, an excellent and very suitable name indeed. Who could say in earnest that his fate and life have been the result of his conscious planning alone? Have we a complete picture of the world? Millions of conditions are in reality beyond our control. On innumerable occasions, our lives could have taken an entirely different turn. Individuals who believe they are masters of their fate are as a rule the slaves of destiny. A Hitler or Mussolini could believe they were such masterminds. Respes finum. I know what I want, but I am doubtful and hesitant whether the something is of the same opinion or not. Hopefully I have succeeded in elucidating the puzzle. Hopefully I have succeeded in elucidating the puzzle. Sincerely yours, C.G. Jung. Now I see. Now I'm going to read part of a letter that's in a footnote here, but before I do that, I'll take a look at what Miles has said. Miles says, "Hi, good afternoon, Miles. There is a Jordan B. Peterson lecture where he shows these machine-like entities stitching DNA strands together and repairing others. Sure looks like science showing us someone's conscious planning." Well, yeah, but we don't always get what we plan for, as we very well know. In fact, last night I started to watch a TV series on demand called Abandoned Things or something like that, and was quite impressive because it was the first one that I looked at was this 16-acre island that the Japanese created in the late 19th century, and ultimately they had something like 5,500 people living on this very tiny space, and what they were doing was mining coal. And this island was out in the middle of the water, and from shore it looked like a battleship. Well, now it's abandoned and has been abandoned since 1972, and so I guess the Japanese got the coal they wanted for about 80 to 90 years, but eventually it becomes useless. Okay, so one of the footnotes here is so in this letter, Dr. Jung had said, to explain the spontaneous origin of such parallelisms, the theory of migration is insufficient. I call them archetypes. Okay, so the point of reading this letter is in part to explain archetypes. So the footnote is to a letter he wrote to an Henri Flournoy on March 29th, 1949. And I'm going to read a relevant section of that. So he's talking about archetypes in history and notes that they go back to early Greece, Tibet, China, and India. And then he says, my inventiveness consists in nothing but the fact that I believe I have proved that archetypes do not appear only in the migration of symbols, but in the individual unconscious fantasies of everyone without exception. I have furnished proof of this in several large volumes, which unfortunately have not been published in French. As I see it, the idea of a psychic pattern of behavior is not at all astonishing, since the similarity of psychic products was admitted to be a fact even by Freud. He is the honor of having discovered the first archetype, the Oedipus complex. That is a mythological and psychological motif simultaneously. But obviously it is no more than a single archetype, the one representing the son's relationship to his parents. So there must be others, since there is still the daughter's relationship to the parents' relationship to the children, the relationships between man and woman, brother and sister, etc. Very probably there are also patterns representing the different ages of man, birth, death, etc. There are any number of typical situations, each represented by a certain innate form that forces the individual to function in a specifically human way. These are the same as the forms that force the birds to build their nests in a certain way. These are the same as the forms that force the birds to build their nests in a certain way. Instinct takes a specific form, even in man. That form is the archetype, so named because unconscious thought expresses itself mythologically. For example, Oedipus. I am only continuing what Freud began, and I often regret that the Freudian school have not known how to develop their masters and I only regret that the Freudian school have not known how to develop their master's fortunate discovery. Okay, so that's the end of that part. That's a bit about archetype. And so what he's saying about archetype here is that what he's saying about archetype is that it is an instinct that comes up in given situations and causes our behavior in certain ways. It's not a nest, but it causes a bird to build a nest in a certain way, for example. So let's see. Miles says, I found one book of Jung's letters to famous people in a used bookstore. It was a thin paperback, yet they wanted $30. Is this high price typical, Skip? Well, I think you may find it less expensive if you go on Amazon used books. Here's my copy of Volume 1 of C.G. Jung's letters, and these are letters from 1906 to 1950. There's a second volume, Volume 2, about the same thickness, which goes from 1951 to 1961. So he was quite a prolific letter writer, so I don't know which book you're talking about. I may have mentioned this book, Encounter with the Self. When I ran into the description of this book, I'll come back, Florida Andrew, to your question in just a moment. When I came across the description of this book, Encounter with the Self, I thought it would be quite interesting, and I went to look for it, and I couldn't find it available on Amazon, but I did find it in Amazon in the used book section, and I had to pay $57 for it. Then, about a month later, I discovered that I could have bought it from the Jung bookstore in L.A. If you put in Los Angeles C.G. Jung Society bookstore, you can find it. They have quite a complete collection, and there it was for sale for $12 a copy. But sometimes we do pay for something. Now, there was a question about behaviorism that came up over here on Periscope. So I was asked, didn't Jung believe in behaviorism? Not really. I think that maybe many other schools of psychology, but I'm not I don't think we could say that Dr. Jung believed in behaviorism per se. He certainly believed in archetypes, but that wasn't. Behaviorism is something else, where you say something like B.F. Skinner, like B.F. Skinner did, where he was working with rats in a box, and he talked about he shocked the rats and they would behave in a certain way. And Pavlov did that too. Both of them did that. I agree. Dr. Jung's idea was more in the realm of depth psychology. And I don't know what appetite YZ would be. So, but anyway, so to carry on, Miles, the C.G. Jung bookstore in L.A. is a very good place to find books about Jung and by Jung. And also Inner City Books, by the way, which publish most of Dr. Edinger's work. Now, Rural Inventor says, I think archetypes give us prophecy as intuition. Well, in some sense, I suppose that would be true. In other words, if I know a woman is going to be a mother, I know certain behaviors that she will execute when she's a mother. And that's because she's programmed to do it that way, and that's what the archetype is. But I think that the foreknowledge type of prophecy that you may be talking about really comes from the idea of the collective unconscious. And that's one of Dr. Jung's main ideas. And you can find that throughout his work, but it appears first in the Red Book. I've read parts of the Red Book that relate to his foreseeing the beginning of World War I, which was actually how he discovered the collective unconscious. And so, anyway. Those were two things I wanted to read today, and I wanted to give people a chance to chat today. Unfortunately, I can't run a live feed with our Jung group this evening because we're going to do it at Sammy's Pizza Restaurant once again. And so we'll see after tonight how we decide to do that in the future. Now, Miles says, what does Jung think of Darwinism? Are we gaining in IQ since these people of the archetypes? I don't think so. Well, I think that Jung believed that Darwinism was correct and that he was discovering the evolution of consciousness. And that's in fact what most of his work is about, is showing how consciousness evolved since maybe 5,000 years ago. I mean, most of his work relates to the biblical times, so about 3,500 years ago, but he also refers to Lao Tzu and other famous people, and some of them predate the biblical period. For example, he does at some places refer to Isis and Horus and so on, and those go back maybe as far as 10,000 years. But he definitely believed in the evolution of human consciousness and the evolution of the God image per se. And so what we have been talking about, and I actually published a video on this today, were our events in the development of the God image. So Dr. Edinger was saying in this other book that I've been reading of Lawrence Jaffe's, I do have it right here in front of me, so I can once again show it. So in this book, Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology, Dr. Jaffe and Dr. Edinger, he's quoting Dr. Edinger, talked about the evolution of the God image, and I'm not sure I can put my finger right on it here, but let's just see. Okay, one of the things he says here, which is in the video I published today, Joachim of Flora, the 12th century theologian, so now that we're talking about something that's 800 years ago, postulated 3 periods of world history: the age of the law, or of the Father, the age of the gospel, or of the Son, and the age of contemplation, or of the Holy Spirit. In Creation of Consciousness, Edinger explicates a similar idea, which may be paraphrased as follows. The first is the Jewish dispensation, which is centered on the law. The second is the Christian dispensation, which is centered on faith. And the third is the new or psychological dispensation. So recognizing the God image in the psyche, and understanding what that means and what we should do about it to change our societies. That's the big question. And it's the question I'm really being called to, as you see by my various videos lately. I've been called more and more to these religious ideas because, as Dr. Edinger says, it's really a pitiful sight to see religions fighting one another when in fact they're all based on the same part of the psyche. And what Dr. Jung discovered was the source of all of them, which they all point back to. And it was Edinger's belief, and I now concur with him, because I see what he means, that once someone realizes this and starts talking about it, then many others will begin to talk about it too. And that itself, that discussion, allows the evolution to happen. And so I think that the Edinger video, which you can see underneath the video that you're currently looking at, you can see a link to it, that Edinger video. You can see where he's talking at about 4 minutes and 8 minutes into it about Dr. Jung's role vis-a-vis all religions. So Miles says, not a linear evolution, but steps in consciousness at discrete moments in time. That's certainly true, but all evolution is like that. I don't think Darwin or anyone else that's looked at evolution since would say that there's any linear evolution per se. And so we need another step up in consciousness ASAP. That's the point, Miles. That's what we're trying to accomplish here, is to help people understand that we need to step up and have another perception of the way we are as human beings and what needs to be done in order to prevent us from destroying ourselves, because we're on track to do that if we keep up what we're currently doing. At least that's my view. And I'm sorry I haven't paid as much attention to my friends on Periscope, but I see I do have one person, and that is Florida Andrew. Carl Rogers, I don't know much about Carl Rogers' psychology. He is mentioned occasionally in Dr. Jung's work, and so there is some linkage, but I'm not very clear on what that is. So anyway, let's see if there's something more I wanted to read. I don't want to take this more than an hour today because I do have a reading group session tonight. Okay, there's another short letter here that I will read, because what I'm reading from The New God Image, from Dr. Edward Edinger's book, The New God Image, is I'm reading the 14 letters that have been hidden from the public by the Jungian community, and in my own small way getting them out there. Now, this particular letter that I just read, the one I just read to Valentine Brooke, does appear in the Collected Letters of C.G. Jung, Volume 2, page 520 to 523. This next one, which is to Robert Smith, is also from Letters, Volume 2, page 570 to 573. So, as I indicated earlier, there are 14 letters. There's 7 of them. There are 7 of them that did appear in the collected work, or in the collected letters of C.G. Jung, and there are 7 that were really buried, and which Jungian analysts and the Jungian societies don't talk about. And that's why I think it's very important to talk about them, because we have people all over the world killing one another over religion, and I think we need to step up human consciousness a little bit on religion. So this letter is fairly short. It's 2 pages, and it's in part, this letter is in part referring to Martin Buber, and let's see. Okay, so at the time, Mr. Smith was preparing a thesis, a critical analysis of religious and philosophical issues between Buber and Jung, and Jung wrote another letter about this, which is in the Erich Neumann letters of February 28, 1952, Note 9, which is also in Letters 2, 243. So there's a footnote that describes the origin of this letter. It says, in this letter, Smith had reported a conversation with Buber in which the latter had accused Jung of being a monologist, having reduced God to an object, and maintaining that Jung's statement that without man no God would be possible was an ontological denial of God. Well, Jung and Buber had a long-standing argument, because Dr. Jung never talked about the metaphysical God, and all Martin Buber did was talk about the metaphysical God. And Martin Buber never could understand what Dr. Jung was talking about because he wouldn't listen. Anyway, Rural Inventor says, you're doing a great job with this channel. I've read Answer to Job many times over the last year, and it's great to hear your readings and view of it. Thanks for your good work. My pleasure, thank you. I'm asking so that I can definitively tell people he was a scientist. Well, I think from the Miles, I think from the Edinger lecture, we can definitively say that Dr. Jung was a scientist. The difference between Dr. Jung and other scientists is that other scientists can use the scientific method, which normally allows them to solve for X. In other words, they can hold all variables constant and come up with an answer for X, whatever it is. That's a simplifying way of putting it, but that's what the scientific method wants to do. The scientific method wants an experiment that can be reproduced. And in-depth psychology, there's no such thing. In-depth psychology, you have to take the whole person, and this was Dr. Edinger's point, that what Dr. Jung did was develop a new science, which was not reliant on the scientific method as it had been developed up till that time. So Clive says, I'm a little hazy on what God means in Jungian terms. Clive, I've been talking about that until I have no voice for the last 2 years, and so you really have to look at quite a bit on the YouTube channel to understand it. Just a moment. I have to have some tea for my voice. Very simply, Dr. Jung was not talking about the metaphysical God. In other words, the God that theologians talk about. What Dr. Jung was talking about was the deepest archetype in the psyche, the most basic archetype, which is the religion-making archetype. And that is called, throughout this work and Dr. Edinger's work, it's called the self, it's called the God image, it's called the transpersonal self, it's called the collective unconscious, and it's all of those and many other things too. And so it's what Dr. Jung would say is it's a psychic fact, but as Dr. Edinger explains, psychic facts are not facts that you can describe in one sentence. Psychic facts are like eating fruitcake. You get all kinds of things when you bite into fruitcake. You get nuts, and you get berries, and you get jellied things, and you get grain, and so on. And so what Dr. Jung was talking about was a psychic fact which cannot be explained in a sentence. And what you need to do to understand what he was talking about, really his 20 volumes are about that. And you can read chapter 4 of Answer to Job. I'm just going to turn off my Periscope because there's nobody there. Swipe down to stop. All right, so let's see if I think I might have succeeded. Okay. Wow, I had 43 viewers on Periscope, believe it or not. Anyway, you can get a start on it by reading Chapter 4 of Ion, which you can find on the YouTube channel. Just go to the homepage of the YouTube channel, and there's a playlist that's set out there for Ion. And in there, Chapter 4 is about the self, and that would be a start. But I don't say that that's a comprehensive, complete answer. But anyway, let's see. Is there a CV for Jung? I will Google for it. Well, I mean, there certainly is a Wikipedia article about C.G. Jung, and there are many biographies of him. He never thought his biography in the physical world was very interesting, and so he thought that the development of his own psyche and the development of his own ideas was the significant part of his biography, and that's what he covered in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. That's the sort of memoir of C.G. Jung's development psychologically. There are plenty of biographies of C.G. Jung. Some of them are salacious, some of them are idiotic, and some of them are just straight up facts. C.G. Jung as a man was a man with definite flaws. There's no doubt about that. He obviously had a very major love affair with Sabine Spielrein before 1913, so before his Red Book period, or before much of his psychology even developed. And many people believe that many of Jung's basic ideas came from Sabine. I couldn't dispute that, not at all. There's a movie made about that period called A Dangerous Method. And if you've not seen it, I urge you to see it. The other fact about C.G. Jung is that he had a 40-year menage a trois that included Tony Wolff, Antonio Wolff. And Jung had a red automobile, and his red automobile was parked at Tony Wolff's house every Wednesday. And he and Tony Wolff and Emma Jung used to go into the psychology club in Zurich together. So, I don't know what to make of it. None of us were in the bedroom, and none of us saw what happened. So, if you want to diss Carl Jung because he was a philanderer, then you're going to miss the greatest mind of the 20th century, or one of the greatest minds. There's Gray Yates. Hello. Is the reading group meeting tonight going to be live streamed? No, it is not, Gray, at the request of my local group. So we're going to have a discussion tonight. If I can get them to persuade, I might try to live stream it off my cell phone, but I've never done that, and I'm not sure it would be great if I did. But as of now, I make no promises. I will try to make a more regular time when we can have regular discussion, and one of the reasons I came online and decided to do these behind-the-scenes sessions is that when I am reading, I can make myself available for conversation, but I haven't been able to find a way to schedule that specifically. Clive says, Dr. Edinger talked about seeing the back of God. What would be a modern version of that? Well, modern version of seeing the back of God. A modern version of it would be what Dr. Jung said fairly plainly, which was God doesn't operate in a very efficient manner. I mean, it's not like we say, oh God, I hope you develop a certain kind of fish, or oh God, won't you make sure that my dinner isn't cold tonight, or something like that, or oh God, can I please make a great touchdown in the football game today? God doesn't operate that way. God operates in a very indirect manner. God operates through the Spirit, what we would call today the Holy Spirit. And so Dr. Jung made the comment that, it took several 100 million years to create the creatures that were originally found in Africa. And human beings only emerged in the last 4 or 5 million years. So until that happened, there was no consciousness per se. I mean, Dr. Jung has a famous quote, human beings were lighting a candle in the dark of mere being, because without consciousness, you don't know anything. And he commented one time he climbed up on Mount Elgon in Africa, and he looked out over the savannah and saw the huge herds of animals down below him, and realized that they had been doing the same thing for hundreds of millions of years or millions of years. And so that's the back of God. The back of God is that God is not very efficient, and God isn't going to strike a lightning bolt and kill your opponent or something like that. Not that God doesn't exist. The problem is when the football player points at the sky when he makes his big touchdown, he's pointing in the wrong direction. He should be pointing in his heart, because that's where the Spirit of God made him do the workouts and the necessary strengthening and other things that he had to do to be able to get that touchdown in the first place. But that has to come through you. It's not going to come because God, God struck the defensive end with a lightning bolt and prevented him from stopping you in your touchdown. It doesn't work that way. Clive says, does the psyche have some kind of goal? Well, this was Dr. Jung's point, that the self does have goals, and the spirit has goals, and those can be different for different people. And so the point of individuation is to find what is the goal in your life. Okay, that's what individuation is about, actually, is finding what God's intention is for you. And but not only for you, for your family, for your society, everything else, and for your nation, every part of humanity going up has a goal. And like one of the things that I like to talk about is I was about the year 2000, I started to ask myself the question. Sorry, my tea is disagreeing with me. I started to ask myself the question, what one factor above all others made the United States the strongest country in the world, with the best economy, and so on. And what I realized was that it's our diversity. That's our secret sauce. And it's our diversity played through very serious debate, which we see on television every night. And we see it in the conflicts in American society. And so we do have a lot of conflict. But what happens is that every bad idea gets worked out of the system very quickly, relatively quickly, let's say. Some might say certain things we see in our politics today are a bad idea, one way or the other. And, eventually those will be worked out of the system. And it does take time because we separate our elections by 2 to 4 years, so we can't, if we find something we don't like that's emerging in our society, it takes us a while to get rid of it. But ultimately, we find our way through. So as Winston Churchill said, Americans always make the right decision after trying everything else. And that's pretty much the way it works. And so, can I say what the goal of the United States is? No, but what I can say is that now that we have the internet going on and worldwide social networking, these ideas are now spreading around the world at light speed. And so every society is going to change and change very rapidly. And some ideas that have been accepted in the United States, for example, will not be accepted in other places, and they will be prevented. And gradually things will be changed for the better for all of humanity. And meanwhile, societies where they don't allow people to dispute, they don't allow debate, and they don't allow ideas to come up, and they don't allow differing opinions, they're just naturally held back by that fact because, one man's idea, no matter how brilliant that one man is ultimately going to get left behind. Right. Gray says our diversity makes us more adaptive as a species is one reason we can adapt to so many situations. Absolutely. And that's what's happening with the internet now around the world, but it's been happening in the United States for 400 years. So anyway, I'm not sure I'm understanding Gray's point about now Dr. Peterson defines it. What is he defining? What are you saying he's defining? Clive says, what about the Buddhist focus on the present moment? Does that relate in any way to Jung? Well, it certainly does, and I was in a meditation group at noontime today with 5 women psychologists, which I do every Monday noon, and we were reading a Buddhist text, and it was incredible to me how much that text sounded like Dr. Jung's discussion of the self. Amazing. And I know that Dr. Jung did feel that the Buddhists had developed a tremendous technology of the psyche, let's say. When you go up and sit in a cave for 800 years and just think, a lot of things can become reality. So, Gray, you're saying that a lot of what Peterson says is saying the same thing. I agree with that, and you know, I know he's being taken as a right winger lately. I don't think that that's accurate. I think that what my interpretation is that we have a lot of young men in the world who haven't had proper fathering, and so they don't understand the masculine principle properly. And I think that what Dr. Peterson is offering is basically a father figure for men who haven't been adequately fathered. And there's nothing wrong with that. I haven't per se heard anything that I disagreed with very strongly with Jordan Peterson, other than his emphasis on all logos all the time. I think he has gone heavily toward the religious approach to developing people along in society, which there's nothing wrong with that. Dr. Jung didn't want to destroy Christianity because he realized that it provided us with valuable structures, and I certainly agree with that. But in order to understand what it's not bad to understand what it's doing. But for example, last night I was able to watch Jesus Christ Superstar with John Legend playing Jesus Christ, and I was quite moved by it. I thought it was an incredible production. It was a live production that they put on for Easter Sunday. And Legend really did express the dichotomy in Christ's own psyche between being the Son of God, as he had presented himself over a long time, and being just an average human being, because the Son of God part of him told him that he basically had to go and give up his life in order to convince others of what he was saying. So he understood that. But the other part of him was saying, wait a minute, I'm a human being. Why am I going to die? I don't understand this. And so Legend has this section in Gethsemane where he's actually asking God about that, and I think that engagement, is in the Bible, and I think it does express the special nature of Jesus Christ as a representative of the self, because his self was telling him that he was a certain man, and it wanted him to do what he did, and yet the ego side of him was saying, what? Do I really have to? And he ultimately realized that he had to. And what Dr. Jung emphasized in this, if you watch the video that I put up the other day, it was the day before Easter, I guess, on we have to live our lives like Christ. You'll hear what I'm talking about, because Dr. Jaffe explains what the significance of what Dr. Jung was saying about about Jesus Christ's sacrifice and his ministry and so on. And I think that that's very useful. And Clive, that would be very useful in terms of an example of what, for that one man, for Jesus Christ, that was what the self wanted him to do. But it isn't what the self wants all of us to do. We each have a different mission. And what individuation is about is finding what that mission is. So, is there a big difference between the manifestation of culture and the God image? Actually, I think, Clive, at the societal level, the manifestation of culture is the God image at the societal level. I mean, there's another interesting video online from Edinger again, which is dated 1997. In that video, which was a year before he died, he looks much older than the one I've been talking about lately. But Edinger talks about how cultures are a mirror of the God image of everyone in that culture. And so, we're not all the same. We all came up through different routes, but basically the God image per se is the same, and it develops in the same way. And so if you look at a culture, you can understand what has come up through that culture. Hold on just a second. This is my wife calling me. Hello. I can. Yeah. Do you want to do that? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm online live right now, so I'm going to keep this short. See you shortly. Bye-bye. Okay. Apologies to my listening audience around the world, but sometimes God has to be responded to. Okay. So I guess I've answered that, Clive, that the God image for a culture is manifested by all of us. And so if we look around the United States, and I'm not sure what country you live in, but in the United States, we have people from every culture, from every race, creed, culture, and country in the world. And we're all Americans. And it largely works. I mean, if you watch cable news, you're going to hear the worst things that happen every single day because, blood sells. And so it's like, eyewitness news, blood at 11, right? Because everybody wants to see a bloody story at 11 o'clock at night so that then they can go to sleep feeling better that maybe their life is better than that other person's life. I mean, that's really the way our psychology works. and so that's all we hear. But the reality is that Americans live together quite well, and we don't have Caucasian Americans going around and murdering Muslims very often. Occasionally it does happen, but in a society of 315 million people now, it happens very, very rarely. And the opposite is also true. We very rarely have a Muslim American attacking a Caucasian American. And so we do get along. And an irony is that the American South has had a huge infusion. About 15% of the population is now South in, Southern continent people from India and Pakistan originally, or their families were from, they may be in the third generation now or fourth generation. Let's see. Okay, so Clive is a Brit, or living in Britain in any case. Did Jung talk about balance between vulnerability and strength? I'm not sure it was ever put in those terms per se. Let me think about that one. Obviously, vulnerability and strength would be a set of opposites, a duality. But and they relate to things like people having an urge to protect people. I often get accused of wanting to protect a damsel in distress, for example, which is an archetypal thing, because there have been women who have worked for me or whatever who I've helped financially from time to time, and so that's vulnerability and strength, and so it's archetypal. Certainly, the damsel in distress archetype is certainly there in a lot of men, and a lot of women use it to get themselves out of trouble on occasion. But men do it too, so it's a revert. It can be reversed also. Earl and Benner, I think culture is an evil made up to keep us off our path. Sorry to be a bore. Well, actually, no, Clive. There's a balance. As the Buddhist would say, there's a middle way. And because, if you read the first page of Psychic Energy by Esther Harding, page 3, in fact, you'll realize that other beings basically live in a brutal world, in a swamp. Wild animals, are devouring and begetting. I mean, this is the point that Dr. Jung made about the several 100 million years to develop consciousness. Other beings are killing one another left, right, and center. And culture is civilization. So actually, I have it taped to my computer because there's a Jung quote which I can never remember. I don't know why. I have a mental block, but I will read it to you. It is, "Too much of the animal distorts civilized man. Too much civilization makes sick animals." So yes, too much civilization can be evil, but by the same token, we can't live in the devouring, breeding milieu and have anything that we have. I mean, you couldn't go out and get into your automobile or you couldn't watch this on television if that were the case. Clive says, how do you know if you're in touch with your personal mission? Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? I'm a old-time artillery officer, and in the artillery we have a saying, ready, fire, aim. And So the way that you get to the right place is you do something, and when you figure out that that's wrong, you adjust and do something that makes it better. That's what I would say. Um, and so let's see. So in terms of your personal mission, you need to be in tune with that, and there's no school solution. There's no truth out there with a capital T. You just have to try things, and that's why the Job archetype is so important, because it's based on defeats. Because if everything is going swimmingly, I mean, if you become a world-class football player or soccer player, I'm thinking of football because it's UK. If you become a world-class football player, maybe nothing ever stood in your way. You were strong, you were fast, you could kick the ball, whatever it was, and nothing ever stood in your way. But when you get to the end of your football career, then what? Then what are you? You're a former football player, but you haven't developed anything else. And so people that build strong egos and then find their place in life are people who have gone through the Job archetype many times, which is having a contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. So in my football player example, let's suppose that you're a football player that has just sailed through, and now you're playing for Manchester United or something, and everything's peachy, and all of a sudden you break your leg. And I broke my leg 28 years ago. I can tell you that there's been nothing the same since then. and so that's a defeat. Whether you won the game where you were playing or not, it's a defeat to have an injury like that. And so you were planning on being a professional football player all your life, and all of a sudden, bang, you're not that anymore. And then you have to lament and regret that you cannot be, and then you have to find what's the next thing. And that's where your self comes in. That's where you pay attention to what your unconscious self is telling you about what the next step is. And ultimately, you will try something else, and that may be the right direction or the wrong direction, but you'll find out pretty quick. And you keep accentuating the positive and eliminating the negative, and ultimately you get to your best self that you can achieve. And I'm not sure I'm my best self, but I'm very satisfied with the current meaning of my life, in the sense that I'm holding the interest of a few people here live on YouTube. And over the years, 30 years now that I've been reading Dr. Jung's work, I've become convinced that he has said some very important things for society for the future. And that's why I'm devoting a lot of my life to making it available to others. And I find purpose in that. I find meaning in that. And, I've done a lot of other things, and those were meaningful too. I was a father. I'm a grandfather of 9. And those are meaningful things, obviously. And, I've built several companies around the world. I've built companies in Japan, in Saudi Arabia, in India, in Pakistan, and several other places around the world. And each time, those were very meaningful things for me. But they're not where I am today. And so, I've found that this is my what my calling is right now. And so these things are very different. I mean, I was practicing law. I was a Marine. I was a U.S. Marine with 23 years in the service. I was a reservist, but the last thing I did in uniform was break my leg. Well, okay, so that means I'm not going to be a general officer. and so I have to lament that fact and then move on, and that's what I did. But I did all right. I was a lieutenant colonel, and I stayed. My classmate was Oliver North, and I stayed in the Marine Corps longer than he did. And we retired at the same rank. So who's a better Marine? I don't know. But anyway, we both had our Marine Corps careers cut short for different reasons, and so we've had to go on and do different things. Ollie went on and made himself a television career and is still selling war stories, and I went on and built a public company, among other things. So everybody does something different, and so you just have to experiment, and you have to go through the Job archetype as many times as you can, really. I mean, if you get defeated, okay, dust yourself off and decide what's the next thing to do. There's always choices. Okay, so Clive says, how should a person deal with the nihilist argument? It seems to take the wind out of your sail. Well, I mean, the point is that there's, I don't know what the nihilist argument per se is, but the point is that our psyches are always in this middle ground between inflation and depression. And nihilism is about depression. And so if you hear somebody saying, oh, you'll never amount to much, you can never do anything, that sort of thing. Well, I mean, if you let that get to you, that's going to be a big problem. I mean, a lot of people do commit suicide. And I know in our military, we have something like 22 troops a day committing suicide. I mean, that's truly atrocious. Now, why is that happening? Well, men are coming home from battle, which is horrible, and they're not being dealt with properly from a psychology point of view. And they have to be able to put that in context. And I did hear Dr. Peterson talk about PTSD recently, where he said, well, PTSD is very easy to figure out where it comes from. It comes from having a naive person and then putting them in a horrible situation. And yeah, that's why we have young people fighting our wars, because they're too stupid to know not to. Basically, I mean, young people are overwhelmed by the warrior archetype, and especially young men are, and so then they go off to war thinking they're going to be a hero, and they might come back without a leg, or they might come back in a bag, and that's pretty horrible either way. And so, if you're letting the nihilists get to you, it's time to go see a therapist, honestly, because we need to keep out of that depression ditch, but we also have to keep out of the inflation or the inflation area too, because we get too big for our britches. And our president is an example of that, where he thought because he could run his company like a bully, he thought he could run the country that way. And I think that he's going to find that he's not able to do that ultimately. And I'm not saying whether he'll succeed or fail, who knows. So far, he hasn't destroyed the country, but he's also not done anything really great that I can see. And he has done a lot of damage to our cultural norms. So where that takes him, I don't know. But but he obviously had this big inflation where he could buy the presidency. Well, yes, he could, but then that could get you in serious trouble, and that's an example of an inflation. And time will tell. Time will tell what the trouble is. So nihilism that bothers me is that I really struggle to justify the things I'm interested in doing at a fundamental level. Well, I'm not a psychotherapist myself, and I don't want to try to offer mental health help here, Clive. But if you can't justify something to yourself, then don't do it. If it hurts, don't do it. Again, the Dalai Lama wrote a book called The Art of Happiness, and basically the sum and substance of that book is accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative. And so or the other alternative is, if you can't justify it but you still want to do it, well, give it a go. And you'll find out pretty quick whether it's the right thing for you, I would suggest. And that's not a logical thing. That's an eros thing. That's getting out into life. I mean, you can logic out anything, and so you can logic out whether something is going to be justified or not. I mean, that could be a logical thing, but that's what's wrong with logos as the one and only way, because you have to get out there and try it, and that's eros. And once you get into life and you get burned by it, then you learn what to do and what not to do. And it gets decided that way. It doesn't get decided logically. So anyway, I think that I better, I've now gone an hour and 33 minutes, and I have a class or a group tonight, so I'm sorry I can't do a group with all of you tonight, but perhaps I will do, we'll figure out what we're going to do tonight and carry on further in the future. So peace, thank you for being here, and I'll talk to you again sometime soon.